In this video, I'll be completing the superstructure and installing the 90mm guns. For the superstructure, I need to do step 26 and then install the aft funnel and this L-shaped structure. The 90mm turrets and barbettes have been constructed previously. All that needs to be done is to form blast bags using putty around the gun barrels and then install them on the previously constructed and painted barbettes. Step 7 shows the photo etch that will go on this piece of superstructure. These support struts have already been installed when this part was assembled. So it's just a matter of modifying the masts, installing some extra detail pieces, and installing the platform. The aft funnel also has a little bit of photo etch on it. It's slightly simpler than the forward funnel because it doesn't have this platform to install. They're just these delicate wires that need to be installed and a long ladder that runs up to the top of the funnel. Since these pieces are large, I'll cut all of them off the sprues. There's no need to keep anything on the sprue for painting. Since we are coming to the end of the build, there are not actually all that many pieces left on the sprue. It's really coming down to the last few parts of the ship itself. Most of the remaining pieces are actually for the aircraft and boats that go on the ship. For this part of the build, there are searchlights, some booms for the cranes, some additional mast pieces for the aft mast, and some smaller superstructure pieces. Once again, it's unfortunate that these masts weren't replaced by brass parts in the detail upgrade kit. I suspect that when I have to rig this model, it's going to be quite difficult with these very thin plastic masks. They tend to bend very easily. The platform on the aft mast doesn't have a photo etch replacement part, which I also found a little bit strange. So the plastic part with some photo etch upgrades will have to do. There are a few modifications that need to be made to these parts. Some of the moldings on these parts need to be removed because they'll be replaced with photo etch parts. Once filed and sanded, these parts will be ready for the photo etch to be glued on. The larger pieces of the aft superstructure can now be glued together. Once they have dried, this will form the base on which I can install the smaller pieces and photo etch. And now to install the photo etch. First up is the photo etch boom on the top portion of the aft mast. This is a simple piece of photo etch to attach. All you need to do is make sure that it is straight. And there are a couple of struts for the underneath of the starfish platform that need to be folded. Once again, this is quite easy to do. I fold them first and then use extra thin super glue and let it seep into the gap to create a good strong bond. And then I place them on the underside of the platform. So far, I've found these ladders to be the most complicated pieces of photo etch in this kit to fold. The reason for that is the rungs on the ladders have to be bent to align with the outside frame of the ladder. Essentially, what that means is that you have to bend these rungs in between these very delicate, almost wire-like struts, which are then going to be used to glue the ladder to the ship. It's quite difficult to work in such a small space and get a good curve. Then there are these little boxes that need to be folded and attached to the mast. These are the attachment points for the cables that support the booms for the crane. It's a bit difficult to know where to place them. They need to be placed in the correct place, otherwise the angle between the pulleys and the ropes won't work. I'm taking a bit of a guess here and placing them roughly where the plastic parts were that I removed, and hoping that that will make everything line up well enough. The final piece of the aft mast to install is this small little triangular piece of photo etch. Moving on to the funnel, there are more of these little rings. I cut the rings so that it's easier for me to position them on the funnel. I positioned the cut so that it will be underneath the ladder so that it is hidden once the ladder is installed. After moving into position, I used extra thin super glue to tack it in place. I then repeated the procedure for the second ring on the funnel. Once again, just using a little bit of extra thin super glue on a piece of wire to glue it in place. I then installed the top of the funnel and glued it in place with extra thin plastic cement. Once that was reasonably dry, I was able to install the last ring on the very top of the funnel. After the funnel assembly had a little bit of time to dry, I then attached the ladders, which I had previously folded. As you can see, the place where I cut the rings is now concealed underneath this ladder. And that then completes the aft funnel. Next, I worked on what I think are the secondary gun directors. There's this platform that goes underneath them. I quite like this piece of photo etch. It's a very good replacement for what is a rather ugly plastic molding. Earlier on, it required me to cut off a lot of plastic such that this photo etch ring could be attached in its place. I used a cylinder to curve the hand railing into the desired shape and then secured it in place with extra thin superglue. The platform and its railing could then be glued onto the cylinder, which forms the core of the structure. And small little support struts could then be cut out, have superglue applied to them, and then be stuck to the platform and the cylinder. The detail improvement on this part is remarkable. The assembled plastic and photo etch parts could then be painted. At this point, the model is basically now only really covered in the light grey camouflage color. There are not many parts left to paint in the darker colors. While the paint was drying, I prepared this larger platform on the Aft Superstructure. All that needed to be done here is for the hand railings to be folded up and curved into the correct position. Once these parts are folded and glued in place, once again using extra thin superglue, the whole platform could be positioned on the plastic part, held securely in place, and then from underneath I used extra thin superglue to secure it in place. The platform is now ready for the details to be installed. First up are the signal lights. I start by tacking them down with some extra thick superglue that I applied to the platform with a toothpick, and then the ship bow, and then all these parts are reinforced with some more extra thin superglue that I apply with a wire. Following which, I installed the aft mast, which I glued in place using plastic cement to give me time to make sure that it is positioned perfectly vertically. And to end this piece, I installed the searchlights. In previous videos, I showed you the preparation for the 90mm turret barbettes. What I hadn't done was install the ladders, and that's because they are on these little stands and they're very delicate. So instead of trying to handle these ladders and paint the parts with them on, I find it easier to paint first and then install the ladder and then hand paint on the camouflage onto the ladder. After the barbettes, I then moved on to prepare for the installation of the secondary rangefinders. The trick here is to get everything to align correctly. There's a gap in the lower level of this platform that needs to align with one of these little binoculars. And then the semicircular platform above that needs to be aligned parallel to the center line of the ship. To do this, I roughly position them in their correct location and then use tweezers and a toothpick to rotate the parts so that they are in the correct alignment. Once they were positioned correctly, I used extra thin superglue to stick them to each other. One of the parts that this kit is missing are blast bags for its 90mm guns. Fortunately, it is not too difficult to craft your own ones. To do this, I used Tamiya modeling putty. It's quite good at this kind of a thing, very malleable and easy to work with. A little bit of it can be placed on top of the barrel, and then using a precision screwdriver can be molded quite easily to fit around it. Fortunately, this putty can be dissolved with lacquer thinner, which won't damage plastic. So if it does go wrong, it's quite easy to correct it. It's just a rather tedious process. This is on 4x speed, and as you can see, I'm going at it for quite a while. This doesn't need to be perfect. I think a little bit of variation between the blast bags is fine. After all, this would be some kind of a fabric. Furthermore, it will be painted black as well, which will also conceal a lot of defects. As long as they're roughly the same size and shape, I think it'll look considerably better than having a bare barrel without a blast bag. I find that after working it for a while, it does get a bit dry and crumbly, in which case I just rehydrate it a little bit with lacquer thinner. And then that gives you more time to work with it. After a lot of back and forth and doing this 12 times, I eventually got them into the state that I liked, and it looks something like this once dried. And once dried, they can be painted. They just need to be painted in black. This is going to help with concealing defects. So it's quite fortunate that the Italians chose to make black blast bags on their ship. It made this a bit easier for me. And this is the completed effect. I'm quite happy with that. So with the completion of the assembly of the 90mm guns, everything could then be sprayed in a clear gloss acrylic coat. The intention here is to seal all the paint in and prepare it for weathering. The weathering process uses enamel paint that will be removed with mineral turpentine. The clear acrylic paint will protect the underlying coats and prevent that paint from being removed and help the enamel paint flow into grooves. And this is now the weathering process using Tamiya black panel line, applying it liberally. Because of the gloss coat, you don't have to be very careful. All of this can be quite easily removed. After letting the panel line dry for around 10 minutes, and then use mineral turpentine to remove it. Since I like a lightly weathered effect, I'll be removing almost all of the turpentine. Even after removing the majority of the panel line, the effect will still be there, and it will help improve the realism of the look. After letting the panel line dry for around a day, everything could then be sealed in with a coat of matte varnish. And that then brings us to quite a milestone, because now, after nearly a year of having these parts loosely sitting around being worked on piecemeal, they'll now be glued to the ship. First up is the aft funnel. Put it in position and glue it down with some extra thin plastic cement. Then this aft portion of the superstructure. Once again, I'm using extra thin plastic cement to stick it in place. Now for a little bit of a tricky part, which is the installation of these cranes. And really here, I'm just hoping that I got everything in the correct position. Fortunately, it looks like I did, and it goes on quite easily. I then installed the bases for the rangefinders. These I had previously glued together so that they were in the correct orientation. It's now just a matter of positioning them on the ship and rotating them so that they're in the correct position, and then gluing them down with extra thin plastic cement. Once the bases had sufficiently dried, I installed the gun directors on the top of the platforms. And now for a 90mm armament installation montage. Since all of these parts had previously been installed and prepared and test fitted and painted and designed to specification, they could all simply be installed in their correct order, stuck down to have the pattern line up correctly with the camouflage. And that brings to end this video and the majority of the work on this ship. This is the part of the build that I consider to be the beginning of the end. In the next video, what I'll be doing is some very small detail pieces to finish off the ship actual. And then what I'll move on to is not so much building the ship, but building things that go on the ship. And there's two major categories, one of which is anti-aircraft guns, and the other which is craft that go on the ship. So the boats and the aircraft. Following that, there's just rigging to do, and then the ship is done. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Cheers.